We do a lot of software-related work. We do a lot of things related to GPS and high-precision navigation, and we have a lot of different software teams around the globe that have tried to do software in a variety of different ways, and my primary responsibility is to help them with it. A key aspect of that is being very honest about what we're doing and how things work. And so one of the things we're going to talk about here is not just some successes with Kanban, but how Kanban can go wrong. And that leads into our title, Platform of Success, or Oubliette for Management. And if you're not sure what that is, you can look it up on your phone or just wait a couple slides and we'll define it. So like I said, I'm Trent Hone. I work as a software process consultant or agile coach or things of that ilk within Trimble Navigation. That's the Twitter handle up there. You can see interesting things that I post about if you want to follow me. And I'm going to be co-presenting with Jim.
Hey.
And I think most of you know him. Hope so, anyway.
So just a little bit of background about Trimble specifically. So when Trent says that Trimble does GPS, Trimble does GPS like Microsoft does operating systems, which isn't as pejorative as it might sound. They basically were the first people in the GPS space. So in the 80s, the 90s, they were the ones when you saw people out on the street getting readings, GPS readings with the big backpacks, because that's what you needed then to get any good GPS read. The big poles, that was what Trimble started making. Since then, Trimble has started buying everybody they could find that had anything to do with geolocation or asset management, and they've built a huge confederacy of companies. So when Trent does his work as an agile coach, it's almost like he's an independent consultant going from state to state, helping actually quite different organizations implement the things that we talk about.
Very true. And not just state to state, country to country, because we like to say the sun never sets on the Trimble empire, which is quite true. So, the Oubliette, what is it? Well, it's that inverted U-shape thing down at the bottom of that graphic. So it's a very ugly little place where you would put people to forget about them. Some of them are no wider than this sign, so you can't do anything but stand up. A very painful place to be. And to give you some sense of how horrible they are, the infamous French prison, the Bastille, which was stormed in the Revolution, had one. And if you don't watch what you're doing, you can have one too. So we're going to talk about two specific Trimble groups. One of them is called the Construction Logistics Team, or TCL, because we like acronyms at Trimble. We're not too far off from the Defense Department that way. And this slide, I like this slide very much because it's a peaceful waterfall, but also because it's a waterfall that flows in a lot of little stages. So a long time ago, the TCL team didn't really have a defined process. Things began to get more traditional waterfallish after a while, but they didn't like that. Things were problematic with that. We've run into a lot of problems with those sorts of things, I think all of us. So they adopted Scrum. But Scrum for them was very much a series of little mini waterfalls. All the negative anti-patterns that we have talked about a lot about Scrum over the past couple days, or at least that I've heard in conversations at this conference, were manifest within this group. And that led to a number of different problems. One that I think is really important was how they thought about risk. Risk for them was a transference. Right? So the product managers would define things in exquisite detail and then hand them off to engineers to implement. And that transferred the risk to the engineers. Well, I've spec'd it out. All you have to do is make it work. And then the software engineers would do a lot of implementation and pass it off to QA. And then it was the QA's problem. So risk was being transferred within the group. And that led to a lot of fear and pain and frustration. Anything you want to add, Jim?
Well, I'll add the next slide.
Yes.
So basically, they started off with death marches, which looked something like this. And then they went on to death sprints, which really looked more like that. What was amusing was they were using process to solve a problem. as opposed to using process to see a problem. So they were trying to wish the problem away rather than actually doing something themselves to examine their work and create shared understandings and actually build a solution. So that's where the next slide comes.
So, yeah, they were pissed off. You got to see how pissed off they were.
Yeah, they were deliciously pissed off. Going into their offices, so they're, you know, it's like complete. It's outside of DC. It is like Dilbert Central. It's an unassuming building without even a sign on it. One story, and you kind of walk in. There's no receptionist. You kind of walk in and say, I wish that I were someplace. How far into the story should I go?
Maybe not too far yet.
All right, I love this story.
But I like to think of it in terms of this little green guy's quotes. So a lot of the risk transference seem to have its basis in fear, right? Fear of being held responsible for something not working out. And of course, this triggers anger and suffering and the rest. And there was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of pain. There was an awful lot of frustration. But if there's any seed of goodness in this flow, it's that suffering led them to action. They wanted to get out of it. They wanted to find a better way to do things. And so they agreed to let me help them with how they were working. And one of the first things that we did was we visited another Trimble team that's based in Westminster, Colorado. And I really love to show this because this, in my experience, is one of the most impressive visualizations of work that I've ever seen. So this was the Kanban board that they had. And it's difficult to make out the details, but the progression here is from top to bottom. So each row each column is a story, and each row are the various states that work to satisfy that story moves through. And you could just go into the conference room where they had this and immediately know where things were and who was working on what and where bottlenecks were showing up. And it was just a fantastic way to visualize work. They've got different colors of Post-its up in the upper right-hand corner. The colors don't translate terribly well, as always with these sorts of projections, but different types of work had different colored stickies. This was great. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
So,
and this is like 2009, 2010.
Yeah, in that neighborhood.
Yep.
And so I got the team in Northern Virginia introduced to this. That started to seed ideas. These folks in Colorado also put us onto this book, which most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, Scrumbound by Corey Lattis. And we ate that up. We thought, all right, what are we going to do next? Well, we thought this Kanban thing was cool. So the next thing we did was we got the Kanban game from several years ago. It's still around, though, and it's a fantastic tool. So we started playing the game. We got very familiar with Carlos and his testing practices, and grew to hate him. And so that was good fun. And we tried to get this Corey guy who wrote the book, but that wasn't possible. So we called this Jim guy instead, and he said he would come and talk with us, and that seemed a good idea. And one of the very important things that we did when we were talking about how to get better, and Jim introduced this to us, is lean coffee, and that's why the coffee is up there. Because all the attempts that this team had made to improve their process before had followed a meeting or been done in a session where the agenda was pre-planned and wasn't allowed to be emergent. And with Lean Coffee, we had a way of gathering ideas and talking about them that didn't presuppose any process or agenda. It was, let's have some ideas and allow all the ideas to bubble up, and we'll talk about the ones that we think are most interesting. And that was a great salve for the team because there was an awful lot of frustration about not being able to talk about the things they wanted to talk about or not being able to solve the problems that they wanted to solve. So I think it's very important to allow for emergent approaches to figuring out how to get better. And now, Jim, you can continue with the story.
Okay, so the emergent approaches with this team were incredibly important because there was a massive division between what is quite literally at the moment this side of the table and this side of the table. So you got manager, 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 and we've got pissed off people. And so when we got together initially, they did what just about anybody did when they call me. They said, "Can you come in and teach us Kanban?" Come in and teach us Kanban is another word for help me, and it has absolutely nothing to do with process, right? It's something undeniably sucks, and we need to be saved from it by somebody. So please come in on your magic flying pie and do that. And so the first thing that we did, you can see on the wall back there, was we used an affinity mapping exercise to plan the agenda for the week, because they were so divided that if I asked them what problems they were having, they would immediately start arguing. So having everybody just say, we all know what the damn problems are, and put them on the wall, that was really helpful. And then we would do a thing where we would do like an hour and a half or so of training, and then we would do a lean coffee, and then we do another hour and a half of training, and we do another lean coffee to start to get them to talk about things that were constructive. And what was it, around about Wednesday that we had the explosion conversation? So what we did was we basically built things up to where they said, all right, maybe I can respect you. And then we intentionally had an incredibly inflammatory lean coffee, which exposed all of the pain and suffering. And then that led us to the next part of this slide, which strangely enough was the policies. So their problem, and I've talked, so a lot of you have heard me talk about this before in various other talks, but this group especially, they had a lot of technical debt in their code. The management had made a management decision about not touching that technical debt. They're like, it doesn't make business, there's not a good business case for spending the money to change that technical debt. The developers were like, if you don't change this, something will explode. Well, something had exploded before I arrived, and it was not a small explosion. It was a 6-month, 7-month derailment.
Something like that, yeah. 6 months, about 6 months.
And so the developers were angry, and they thought that they were saying that it wasn't a sound business decision to put that off, which it still was.
Part of the problem was a lack of an ability to really talk about and conceptualize technical debt within their framework. We can all stand up here and say technical debt, and I think all of you have a good sense of what that means. They didn't have a good sense of what that meant for them. So they would say to the project manager terms like technical, or product manager, things like technical debt, and he would ask for more description. Not because he was trying to be aggressive or ignorant, but just because he wanted to understand. And that's where the conversation began to break down. Because to developers and engineers, it was obvious. The value of working on these things to make the product better, the infrastructure of the product, was just obvious. Well, we need to do that. And there wasn't a mechanism for getting beyond that impasse. There wasn't a way to visualize it or conceptualize it or quantify it or talk about it in any meaningful way.
So the big difference here is that you had one side of the table that was thinking about business risk. You had another side of the table that was thinking about engineering risk. Neither of them cared about each other's risk profile. And so a big part of this meeting was, yes, we built them a Kanban, yes, we set up policies, and yes, that's been good for them. But the big thing was actually just to get them to acknowledge that there were professionals on both sides of the table who had different views of the same thing, and those were both valid.
That was huge. And you may note, I mean, there are an awful lot of policies that have been written up here, right? And these policies are, not all of these were implemented. Many of these were discarded. But they're there from the meeting because they're all there to address some kind of pain or friction or uncertainty or discomfort that members of the team have had, right? And a lot of these began to take care of themselves once they could conceptualize and view their work in a more unified way. You know, once they all came together in terms of respecting each other and then visualize the work in a common frame, a lot of those policy problems went away. So this was one of the draft Kanban boards that was generated from the sessions. And it's, it's fairly simple. We've got some in process and done divisions on some of the lanes, but this is a fairly typical, simple Kanban style board. And they tried to implement a board like this, a physical board like this initially. But one of the great challenges that this team has is most of the software engineering is done in Northern Virginia. A little bit of it is done also in Massachusetts. Most of the testing is done in Tempe, Arizona. A little bit more of the testing is done in Chennai in India. And some of the product management leadership is based in Colorado. So doing things in a physical board for this team fairly quickly became impossible and extremely difficult to manage. And so they moved to a virtual system, a lean kit system. And you can see, well, it is a little difficult to see, but there's really only one difference between that mock-up that was on the whiteboard and the actual board that they began to work with, and that was a blocked or a waiting lane that they've added. But otherwise, it is almost identical.
Yeah, so that waiting lane is actually an external resource lane. And what they were doing was they were counting external resource activities as their own. So they simply made another one. What was striking about this team is that before the end of that week, they were so excited about actually moving from the physical board to the lean kit board that they signed up for lean kit at night. After we'd had like really intense and emotional days, at night they would all go home and figure out how to use lean kit, and they'd started integrating it with TFS and a bunch of other things before we'd even left at the end of the week. So this is literally like one of my favorite teams ever, because they were incredibly not only anxious to solve their own problems, but ridiculously self-directed.
One of the key points of friction had to do with predicting schedules and timelines. Jim mentioned that one of the things that ran off the rails that triggered him coming to visit was a release that was off by about 6 months or so. And so trying to get a better handle on that was a strong motivation for this group. And they thought, hey, if we can get away from using story points and estimating in these ways, which are leading to these, being 6 months off on a 7 to 9 month kind of a release, then that would be fantastic. So after looking at the Kanban approaches, they figured, well, we can just look at how many stories we get done in a certain amount of time, as long as we have a right size of the stories. But we ran into some friction with that, so we had to prove and demonstrate that that would work. And this is from a presentation that we used after we saw that it was starting to work. So this is probably difficult to see, but this is the data that comes out of lean kit, and they got to a point where stories were taking an average of about 12 days. And after they felt comfortable in that baseline, they looked at the next upcoming release, which was going to take about 6 months, they thought, or at least that was the target, and figured out how many stories were in there and used this 12 days to figure out what the schedule ought to be. And instead of being off 5 to 7 months, as they had been before with releases of a similar magnitude, they were off by 1 to 2 weeks. And they considered this quite a significant accomplishment. However, there were some problems with this implementation, right? So they have this very nice Kanban board, and it works well. And when Jim was there, we talked about other areas that would benefit from visualization, right? So the board is the dev and the test section. Farther downstream, they have beta and deployment, and earlier on, they have some planning and prioritization activities. And there was a plan, there was a view to have one board that would encompass all this. The dev and the test would roll up into it, but it would allow them to visualize planning and prioritization, and then the beta and the deployment. But that board never came together. So those visualizations didn't happen. And I think this is one of the things that triggered the next problem. So I'm calling this the door to the Oubliette. WIP, they were doing a good job at managing the WIP on the board for the team, but there was a pull or a need or a desire to do more projects simultaneously. Okay, well, how are we going to do that? Well, there was a clever idea at one point to begin to have a board for every project that they were working on. And before long, they had 5 different boards. And I regret very much that this happened, but I have to visit other Trimble teams and talk to these guys maybe once or twice a month. And before I knew it, this was happening. And oh my goodness. So the folks who were having problems, who were vehemently arguing when Jim was there, were coming to me and saying, I have work across 3 or 4 different boards. I have no idea exactly how much my WIP is, let alone the whole different team. So the failure to visualize things earlier on leads to this crush of work, and now there's a way to manage it. The Kanban boards, let's throw Kanbans at it, woohoo! And so everybody's working furiously, and each one of these different little systems is effective, potentially even efficient, but what's happening to the people?
Yeah, so that. I know that in previous talks you all heard me say the death march, death sprint thing, but this was the first time that I ever fully saw the death marathon, and it was gorgeous. The only other thing that's come close is when Derek and I worked at a company in Milwaukee, and we went in and everybody in the company was working on 6 or 7 projects at once and doing 3rd-tier support. And doing favors for other people in the company. And you're just like, seriously? So when Trent called and said, this is happening, I was like, that's terrible.
And he smiles when he says it.
Yeah, I'm really bad that way. But this is one of the beautiful things is that we're not in the job of building Kanbans. We're in the job of building systems. And systems need tending, so you can't just push the Kanban button and walk away from the machine, right? You have to actually go back and every so often say, what crazy human stuff are you doing now? And they'll say, well, I'm not doing anything crazy, but I've got 7 boards and they're beautiful. And then you say, oh, well, okay, maybe we should talk about that.
Right. So they were doing a very good job at burning themselves out. Unfortunately, we've talked about this a couple times since, and they are killing off the project boards as those projects finish and moving back to a single one. But I think this is a very nice example story because Jim and I point to this as a success, and they did really great. But then they entered into this realm where they took their greatness and sort of fed it back onto itself and created almost a hell. And it's really neat the screwed up places our minds can take us.
Yeah, it's like I like chocolate, therefore I'm going to eat everything chocolate.
We'll move now to another Trimble group, and this group's in Vaughan in Ontario, and they also do software, a different type of software, not very GPS related. This is more into building construction and planning how we build buildings. And one of the best ways, I think, to introduce some of the things that were going on with this team is to talk about the story of the blind men and the elephant, which is a tradition from South Asia where they have elephants. And so each one of these blind men touches a different part of the elephant and has a different sense of what this beast is or thing is when he touches it. And so, right, depending on what piece they're touching, they think they're different things. And this elephant has a guy riding on it, so he probably thinks it's a chair. That's not part of the traditional story. But they're all coming at it from the work that they're doing, from different perspectives, and thinking about it from those different perspectives. And I like this analogy because it's very personal. Each of these is an individual, and we saw that with this group. But also, they were factionalized along organizational lines, right? So there was more commonality in the QA view of the work than there was, and then another set of commonality in the dev. And it was very easy for them to get in a position where you had factions competing for dominance in terms of how to view the work, how to organize the work, and particularly how to organize the Kanban board, right? Didn't you see hours of argument about this?
So my favorite parlor trick is just getting teams to agree on what their workflow is. And that sometimes can take several days. And the conversation actually isn't about the workflow. It's about what people's expectations are of each other and how and those expectations are not being met. So with this particular group, they were lovable but contentious. And so they were going back and forth. Well, and I'll pause myself there. I'll let you tell your part of the story, and then I'll come back in.
Yeah, so a lot of back and forth, a lot of how should this work? And this uncertainty with how to organize and how to approach a Kanban system, because they seemed to buy in, even before they talked to Jim, I visited them, and they seemed to buy into this Kanban idea. We talked about Scrum, we talked about Kanban, and they preferred a Kanban-style approach. But there was a lot of uncertainty in how to put it together. And the development manager responsible for this group wasn't comfortable with that uncertainty because his job is on the line to make sure that this team works the way that they want to work. And so he eventually had enough of this fractured approach to figuring out what to do and decided that he was going to impose order on the system, right? Clench his fist. Yes. And so he designed the Kanban board to reflect his needs and what he thought the merits were. And I've called this the deepest dungeon because I have never seen a Kanban board this complex and sophisticated, let alone any sort of management system exactly this way, right? So we've got some sections of their board, and this doesn't look so bad. It's very difficult to see the different columns from where you are, but when you begin to realize that this is just their unplanned work, then you begin to think, well, wait a minute, what else is going on? And then you scroll down a little bit, and you get to, these are the different stories. Each story has a horizontal swim lane. And there's 8 pages of them as you scroll down. And then you realize, well, wait a minute, but there's all these different levels of the work that's going on, and you click on different tickets in this view, and you bring up another Kanban board, and you click on some of the tickets on there, and you bring up another Kanban board. So you have to drill in 3 levels to actually see what anyone is doing. And this was just a masterful creation of overcomplicated views. And this over here, this is the QA backlog, right? Because they have too much work in the system because they can't see it all and they can't manage it very effectively. And it reinforces the factions that had created or had been created. So dev is doing its dev thing and QA is doing its QA thing. And when dev over-optimizes, what happens? Well, we get a very large QA backlog, which is what that column was. And at the time this image was taken, there were 25 different things in it, 25 fairly sizable things. So rather than enabling the team to work together more effectively, this visualization reinforced the factions that already existed and further divided the group.
So when we were having the initial conversations with this team, first to do the value stream mapping, there were 2 whiteboards in a room, and I put them on each whiteboard, and they immediately kept running between whiteboards to argue with each other. So I had to take one of the groups and actually move it to a different room and say, okay, you make your value stream over here. There were 2 fairly powerful people, so we put one on each team, and then what happened was you got the 2 competing sides. And then the next day we came and we split the teams in half and then divided those people and sent them in different directions so that they would comment on the previous day's work. But the project manager for this was, as he mentioned, a fairly dark lord. And he actually came around after a time, but one of the reasons why, if I can use this word, why we allowed the creation of something this crazy was because the only way they could learn how to really build their own board is to really mess it up and really cause themselves more pain. And this is one of the biggest sins of any online tool is that you no longer have the space constraints of the whiteboard. So you get periscope management. It's like, I see your, it's almost like on Romper Room with Miss Linda. She's like, I see Derek working on this, and I see Don working on that. And so, but you can't see everybody working on everything. And so the good news is they fixed it.
Yeah. They got into that suffering dynamic and got tired of this. And fortunately, the development manager also got tired of this. And so after playing the game and going through another couple iterations, they created this board. And this is it. This is the whole view. It all fits more or less on one screen. We've got some things in the done column over there on the right that are tailoring off. And you can see pretty quickly that there's a red column there that's exceeded its WIP limits, but now they can see that it's exceeded their WIP limits. Now they actually have a WIP limit, and they can talk about that in their stand-up. And this has had an amazing transformational change on how they do stand-ups and how they talk about their work and the level of alignment that exists within the team. It's been really nice to observe. And what it took going away from their dungeon was the development manager stepping back a little bit and allowing the rest of the team to collaboratively create a board that they believed in and had confidence in, and then this resulted. And it's really pretty cool.
Yep.
So, one of the things that I think is a really important lesson from these two teams and experiences that I've had, and I've gotten Jim to buy into this, so it's fortunate he's up here too, is one of the things that I really like and I think is important for us to understand as we work with teams and as we think about ourselves as coaches or however we define our work is a quote from Alicia Guerrero, and she's been speaking at the Lean UX conferences. I'm not sure how many of you might be familiar with her, but she's not an agilist. She doesn't do software. She's a philosopher, and she thinks a lot about complexity and complex thinking and complex adaptive systems. And I really like this quote of hers from the most recent Lean UX about how we can't cause innovation to happen. We can only create the conditions where it could occur. And if you substitute change for innovation here, I think it's very applicable to a lot of the things that we do. So I see Kanban and also our work as coaches with teams as following this sort of line, right? I think Kanban is extremely powerful because it creates a catalyst for conditions to enable change. And we, or at least I like to think of my work as doing the same sort of thing, right? I go to teams and I try to create an environment that helps them observe or trigger or believe in the changes that they want to make. So I think this is a very powerful statement and something that's worth keeping in mind.
What I'd add to that is that it's very tempting because a Kanban is a tool and it's a very useful tool and it engenders a lot of action. And that's intoxicating when you're the person who is helping put the board up. You're like, look at everybody do all the cool stuff. But underlying that board, the board is only going to be as powerful as the social structure that's underneath it. And different social structures require different implementation paths. So there is no one implementation path to a healthy team or a healthy organization. And I know Derek enjoys in kind of this sick, sadistic way going into places and just seeing how deliciously dysfunctional people are and saying, okay, if I directly tell you to do what's right, you will punch me in the face and that will be the end of the conversation. But if I can do some subtle things to trick you into understanding what will be helpful, then that's going to actually lead to long-term systemic change. So both of these teams, when Tony Ann and I went in to work with them, as Trent said, they were already bought into Kanban as a thing. So theoretically, all they needed was the book and a class, and they could go. But neither of their social structures were ready to actually accept the change. And so all we basically did was go in and we just kind of massaged the soil a little bit, added some fertilizer here and got rid of some weeds, and then stepped back and said, the rest of the stuff, you can figure out. We gave them some classes, we taught them what cycle time was, but they were good self-starters who had all been stuck in bad systems. And so that's part of the Oubliette is we drop people into there and we just say, now, come out when you've developed something. And what we're trying to do is like daylight them and let them see what's going on. So,
right. And part of the reason that they were sold on Kanban by the time you showed up is because of the engagements and sessions they'd had with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which sort of followed this line.
Really, actually, to back that up, I think Trent travels almost as much as I do, bouncing around from Trimble place to Trimble place. And it's funny because the company supports what he does and has no idea what he does. and I think that the conversations they probably have when he's gone is, I don't know who that guy is or what he does. I just know that when he leaves, things are better than before he got there. And that's a hard position to be in, especially when sometimes you have to lay a lot of groundwork, and then you're like, okay, I've done all the work. Now I have to let these yahoos come in and take all the credit.
Yeah. Sometimes I do think of myself as a little bit of an insurgent. He travels around and, have you thought about it this way? It disrupts the existing mechanisms and systems and helps prime them for change. Yeah. It's kind of a neat job, except for sometimes the travel gets really tiring. So a few things in closing. These two come out of Jim, or Jim. I like these as the two basic ideas of Kanban. So a lot of people have seen these before, I'm sure. I think if we get too far beyond that, we can run into trouble. But I do like to add the idea.
I said it didn't want to be added.
No, it didn't want to be added, but now it's added. The idea of catalyzing conditions. And I've got up there a picture. This is my house. This is a kitchen. And the cupboards in the kitchen. And it's very simple to doing done Kanban. This was a dinner that my wife and I did, and she's a very good and effective cook. The problem is she's not very good at explaining what's in her head while she's cooking. So I wanted to be helpful. And usually how that had turned out was, what should I be doing next? I don't know. What should I be doing next? I really want to be helpful. Get out of my way. I want to do it. Because she felt like under the pressure of the situation, it would take more time to explain to me what to do next than to just do it herself. And I can't say she's wrong about that. But with this dinner, we talked about the different things that we had to prepare. And we wrote on these rather large Post-its what the things were, when they had to start, based on how long they had to cook or how long we thought they might take to prepare, and the temperature that they had to go into the oven. And it's all up there. So as soon as I got done with something, say cleaning or cutting some vegetables, I could look up and figure out, now I should do that. And it allowed this seamless unity of effort that I'd never experienced in a kitchen before, except when I was doing it myself. And I thought it was fantastic. So this is just a simple, different way of looking at this. It's not software, but it's the same sort of thing, right? We created a condition where we could work and collaborate together without having to talk about it much.
What I would add to that is literally millions of people around the world have personal Kanbans, but you know that you're married to a process geek when you have implementation and success criteria written on your personal Kanban in the kitchen. So the thing that I would add is that, so one of the reasons why Tony Ann and I start with those two bullets and not with all of the bullets that are in the Kanban method is because a lot of times when we arrive, we are still laying the groundwork for things. So all of the rest of the bullets in the Kanban method, they come basically after we've used these two things to stabilize the patient, if that makes sense. We've always kind of come in weird rescue mission kind of sort of things. Really? I thought it was going to be less than that.
No, we're tracking well.
So I'll say all of the teams. So even the teams that we haven't touched at Trimble are using all of the Kanban method bullets, even though some of them, needed initially some special treatment to get there.
Yep. Cool. And that is the last slide. So we'd like to entertain your questions now, if you have any. Yes?
What's the time scale for these transformations?
So the question was about timescales. The TCL team, I think the first time you came to visit was 2012?
Yeah, 2011.
2011, 2012.
Yeah.
So that one was close to a year, the whole thing. And then there was the regression to the multiple project boards and now back from that. But
Yeah.
I would say start to finish a year is about right. I initially thought it would be about 9 months, but it went over that. And the one with Vaughan in Ontario, what has that been? A little bit no, not quite longer. The first time I went to them was in December, and then the last visit where they came out with that new board I was happy to show off was in October. So that one was closer to about 10 months.
Yeah. So when you say a year for TCL, what is the end point of that transformation?
That's a good question.
Yeah. So
when I was ready to say, I think you guys can run with it now, okay. And I can go focus on other things.
Okay. So to
and perhaps that was premature.
Well, or post-mature. So what I would say about that team, the TCL team especially, was that those guys were ridiculous. Like I said before, they were ridiculously self-directed. So I would say that their cultural transformation was fairly immediate. Their maturation in using the appropriate metrics and understanding how they were going to improve their processes, that took a little more time.
Yeah, but you're also not seeing a lot of the earlier work that went on,
okay.
The churning about what to do and how to do it
so
prior to your engagement.
I came in the middle of the year.
Yes, you did.
Okay, all right.
Yes?
Could you speak a little bit more about using a distributed Kanban, stand-ups, challenges, things that worked well, things that didn't work well with the distributed team and the Kanban board electronically?
So the question is about distributed teams, the electronic board, stand-ups, what works well, what doesn't work well. I think they do have a stand-up. It happens in the afternoon so that the people from Tempe can participate as well, and it's not too early in their mornings. One of the mechanisms that they've tried to employ is to have a stand-up in India that then feeds into that stand-up, so a representative attends both. And that seems to work fairly well. There were a lot of challenges initially. One of the things that they decided to do that I think is really productive, and they don't do this in the stand-up, but they decided early on when they were having interpersonal challenges, when they would have a phone call or a chat, they would open up a window. So everybody uses their webcams. So when you talk with somebody in a remote location, you look at them when you talk. And they felt like that cut down on a lot of the friction that can develop, because you've got a higher bandwidth mechanism then for your communication. You can see somebody's emotions in their face when you're talking. I do think that their stand-ups oftentimes take too long because of the number of people that are in them. And I don't think it takes too long because of the time, but because of the level of interest seems to wane over the course of it, right? If everybody was engaged over the whole stand-up, maybe that wouldn't be taking too long. But that doesn't seem to be what happens. So I think they have some work to do in that area. Yes?
You talked about competing factions in some cases that you saw between developer test and how the board can only work as well as the underlying social structure. What are some of the exercises that you do or tools that you use to improve the underlying social structure? I know you say you kind of throw them maybe in a separate room together to work things out.
So the question is about tools to improve the underlying social structure. Jim, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, I actually think that either you or Derek should answer that for me. To be honest, a lot of the things that I do are reflexive, and then later on I figure out what I did. I am really big for retrospective coherence for a lot of those methods. But the main things that I do is like how can I both daylight and depersonalize the arguments that people are having. So I will try and use people's initial Kanban boards to visualize whatever the structural problems are that they're having. So if there's a problem, let's say it's a stereotypical problem, like the Vaughn problem, where testing is sitting there going, I wish I had a reason to exist, and holy shit. And then it happens to them every iteration. Being able to visualize the actual impacts of that, and then also making sure that when those interpersonal problems have workflow ramifications, that everybody maintains responsibility for a piece of work until it's truly complete. So we talk a lot about DevOps, but I think that we should have DevQuaOps.
Star ops.
And yes. So start ops, bang, bang, right? Most of the problems that we have are due to siloing, or they're due to fundamental lack of understanding about what we're building and who we're building it for. So one of the other things, that, especially with my recent clients, that we've had to do is we've had to back up and say, you guys want a Kanban, but you don't even know what you're building. Wouldn't it be nice if you actually, even if you're wrong, if you just agreed on what you're building? So there's some root causes in the business world, and they're seldom truly personal. They're usually systemic. So it's the Deming quote that a bad system will beat a good person every time. So look into the system, see what it is that's causing those problems, and then draw the system for them, usually for the first time, and say, look, awesome, 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 sucks, awesome, awesome. Let's tweak the sucks. How do we do that?
Yeah, to get more to a specific technique, what I did with the Vaughn group and do with a lot of other teams is a value stream map, right? So that then we have a shared sense of how work flows through the system. And usually that's never been done. Mm-hmm. And that helps. Then you can that's the process. That's how the work is being done, as opposed to you're not doing the right stuff at the right time for what I need. Yep. So it helps change that conversation and get past some of that friction. But even with that, there needs to be time, and I try to plan into my sessions just we are gonna sit around for 2 or 3 hours and complain about each other for a while so that you can get that out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tendency when you get into a meeting like that to want to stop people from arguing, but sometimes it's pretty good to just let them argue in front of somebody else for a little while. But again, the biggest recommendation I can give is to always try and visualize and externalize the pain. You can use affinity mapping, you can use a Kanban, you can use card sorting exercises. There's a million different ways, well, less than a million, but still a lot of different ways that you can do that. And often just the act of writing it down calms people down enough that they're able to talk about it. Lean coffee actually works fairly well for that as well.
It does. Other questions? Yes.
Okay, one quick, before we answer this question, is we are out of time, but nothing comes after this. So more than happy to keep answering questions. Just wanted to let you know that we're not holding you hostage. Okay.
So when you were in the process of the journey where you were stabilizing the patient, so to speak, with the visualization and the limiting lift, did you run into leadership who was very impatient and wanted to talk about the end and how fast can we get there, and I want a timeline from you, and if so, how did you manage that to make the leader understand, I'm not going to give you a timeline because I'm setting myself up for failure if I say, oh, by this date we're going to be there.
Yeah, so the question is about timelines and managing leadership expectations about when are we going to get there, there being a system that is stable enough to lend some predictability and improve the world, right? Yes, and be perfect, right, because the system must be perfect. One of the great advantages with the TCL engagement was that the guy who was most concerned about that was in the sessions. And if I could be completely honest about it, he was also one of the ones who was triggering a lot of the pain or is caught up in the pain dynamic. So he got a good sense of what needed to happen as far as the team going through its journey before it got to a point where it would reach that phase and that step. Now, that's not to say that he didn't lose or that his patience level didn't reduce over time. But because he had been there, there was a common frame, and that could be brought back up when he tried to impose schedule and timeline and such things. I do think that the team was a bit lucky in the predictability because they hadn't been at it very long before they arrived at that 12 days, that 12-day average. And they knew it was an experiment to try to predict the next release. And it came out very well, but it might easily have not. I think they were a little lucky in that sense. But that's why they did that quickly, is because there was a lot of pressure to be predictable. Fortunately, there was some willingness to experiment. And there was also a lot of patience with the Vaughn team. I think their management recognized that things were in a bad enough situation that it just was going to take time to get better. And there was a real recognition of the emotional differences that existed.
Well, one of the things about the TCL team was, yes, the management was in the room. They were actually, like I said, on that side of the table. But the other thing is that after we had them kind of discuss things and get kind of some common ground, that made the developers actually want to work harder to prove to management that they were worthy of the new faith that was being put in them. So you had respect being introduced, and then you had respect being honored when it was actually granted. So that was a big part of that. In other places, obviously we haven't had that luxury. So management looked something like this, and they said, give me stuff. And so when that happens, and we had this conversation this morning at Lean Coffee, understanding why management is asking for things, and then finagling your way to talk to management as much as you possibly can. So don't say, I would like you to be part of our stand-ups, or I'd like you to do all these things where we can iterate. Just say, hey, speak management to them. I'd like a weekly one-on-one. And then they say, okay. And then you come with a mixture of statistics, so you can say, look, numbers. But then also come with a story, come with a narrative that says numbers, context. And then each week, the numbers will change, the context will change, and they'll start to see the evolving story. And then they'll say, okay, I'm not only watching the number fluctuate, but I'm understanding why it fluctuates. And usually, they will buy into that. But if you go in and you tell them, I'm going to do this crazy stuff that's completely antithetical to everything you learned when you got your MBA, and you expect them to say, okay, they're going to say, no, it's not okay. So it's up to us as change agents to be able to describe our change in the language in which the people upon which we are inflicting it. So. And are we done?
Looks like we are.
Yep.
No more questions.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.